The storm hit O'Hare at 4:17 inches the afternoon. Not gradually the way Chicago winter storms usually announce themselves with a darkening sky and a dropped temperature, but all at once, the way a curtain falls. One moment the departure boards were green and optimistic. The next, half of them blinked amber. Gate agents reached for their headsets. The revolving doors at Terminal 1 pushed in travelers wearing masks of ice-dusted irritation, trailing rolling luggage that left dark, wet tracks across the polished floor. The terminal itself had the particular noise of a delayed afternoon. The elevated pitch of people recalculating plans, the specific urgency of gate changes announced over an intercom system that swallowed consonants. A child, somewhere near baggage claim, was crying with the full commitment of someone who had been traveling too long. A group of businessmen in identical Navy coats stood in formation around a flight board, phones out. All of them making different calls to different people who would all hear the same news. None of this was Ethan's problem yet. Ethan Cole had been running for 11 minutes, not metaphorically. Actually running, his left hand gripping Lily's wrist so her feet barely touched the ground, his right hand dragging a duffel bag that kept swinging into the knees of strangers who said hey or watch it and whom he had no time to apologize to. He was wearing a coat he'd bought 4 winters ago, the kind that had been adequate when purchased and was now just honest about its limitations. The collar was damp. His boots, dark-soled and work-worn, had soaked through somewhere between the parking structure and the shuttle stop. Daddy, slow down. We're almost there, Lilybug. Almost. She was 6 years old and small for her age, with dark hair plastered to her forehead from the cold and eyes that had not yet decided whether this was an adventure or a catastrophe. She was wearing the purple coat with the broken zipper that Ethan had been meaning to replace since October. Her mittens were mismatched, one striped, one plain, because the matching one had disappeared behind the radiator in their apartment on Belmont, and he hadn't found it before they left. The gate for Flight 247 to Seattle-Tacoma was at the far end of Concourse B. By the time they reached it, the final boarding call had already been announced, and the gate agent, a young man with the particular exhausted patience of someone who had absorbed a full day's worth of weather-related anger, was lifting his radio. "Cole?" Ethan said, breathing hard. "Ethan Cole. 2 passengers." The agent typed, frowned, typed again. "Mr. Cole." A pause. "It looks like you've been upgraded." Ethan stared at him. "Seats 3A and 3B. First class." The agent said it the way you might read from a script in a foreign language correctly, but without full comprehension. He looked at Ethan's coat, then back at his screen. There was a cancellation on a priority member. The algorithm redistributes automatically. "Oh." Ethan reached for the boarding passes. "Okay, thank you." The jet bridge was narrow and smelled of recycled air and de-icing fluid. Lily had stopped running and was now walking with great purpose, holding Ethan's hand from below instead of being dragged from above. The shift had happened quietly, the way these things do with children. One moment she needed carrying, the next she was walking beside you, as if she always had been. "Are we in the front?" she whispered. "The front," he confirmed. "Like the captain? Not quite that far front." She considered this. "But closer than usual?" "Considerably." The aircraft was a Boeing 737, and first class was 6 rows of wider seats with a dividing curtain that had not yet been drawn. Ethan found 3A and 3B, lifted the duffel into the overhead bin, noticing, as he did, the monogrammed luggage that surrounded it. The leather handles, the systematic efficiency of bags, packed by people who did this every week, and settled Lily into the window seat. He sat down. He buckled his seatbelt. He looked at the seat back in front of him, the airline logo, the fold-down tray table, the pocket containing the safety card, and the in-flight magazine, which had a wealthy man's kitchen on the cover. The cabin was already 3/4 full. Nobody said anything. But the silence had texture. It came from the man in 2B First 50s, silver cufflinks, the specific kind of tan that does not come from a beach but from a latitude. He looked at Ethan the way you look at a word you do not recognize in a sentence you thought you understood. A brief pause. A recalibration. Then the careful, practiced return to his phone. A woman across the aisle 4A, a matching luggage set stacked perfectly above her, did not look away quite fast enough. Her expression wasn't cruel. It was something more common than cruelty. Simple certainty. The certainty that something was out of place, and that she had correctly identified it. The seat in 2A was occupied by a woman who did not look up at all. She was working, laptop open, a stack of printed pages beside her. Reading glasses perched low on her nose. Her coat was charcoal cashmere and had been placed with precision over the armrest beside her. She had the focused stillness of someone who had long since stopped noticing who else was on the plane. Lily pressed her face to the window. "There's so much snow," she said. "There is," Ethan agreed. "Does snow stop planes?" "Sometimes. Not tonight." "How do you know?" "Because we're still boarding." He helped her with the seatbelt. The first-class buckle was slightly different from economy, and she looked at it with the focused curiosity she brought to all mechanical things. "We're going to see Dr. Hartwell tomorrow morning. Remember?" "I remember." A pause. "Will it hurt? The appointment?" "No. It's just pictures. Like a camera. But for your heart." She turned from the window and looked at him with dark, serious eyes. "A camera that goes inside me?" "Sort of. You lie very still, and it takes pictures from the outside. You won't feel anything." She thought about this. "Okay," she said, and turned back to the snow. The flight attendant, her name tag read Diane, moved through first class with the preliminary round of pre-departure drinks. She stopped at 2B, 4A, the rows behind. She reached 3A and 3B, and smiled the automatic smile, and then did what Diane perhaps did not realize she was doing. She slowed, a fraction of a second. A recalibration of her own. "Can I get you anything before departure?" "Water for her, please," Ethan said. "Just water for me." "Of course." She moved on. The water came. Lily drank it with both hands around the cup and watched the ground crew through the window with the focused attention of a documentary filmmaker. Ethan looked straight ahead and said nothing. There are men who are quiet because they have nothing to say, and men who are quiet because they have learned when saying something costs more than it returns. Ethan Cole was 35 years old and had been the second kind for approximately 7 years since the evening. He sat across a conference table from 2 HR representatives at North Grid Systems and understood, from the careful way they spoke, that the company he had given 4 years to was 12 weeks from bankruptcy, and that none of the people currently employed there had been told. He had signed his severance papers without argument. He had driven home in the dark. He had sat in the parking lot of his apartment building for 23 minutes, not because he was devastated, though he was, but because he needed to find the shape of the next sentence before he walked through a door and said it. That was the nature of him. He did not speak until he knew what he was going to say. He did not act until he had understood, as fully as the available information allowed, what the consequences would be. This had made him, in his previous career, an unusually reliable systems architect and an unusually forgettable colleague. People remembered the fixes. They rarely remembered who had implemented them. He had driven home in the dark. He had sat in the parking lot of his apartment building for 23 minutes. And then he had gone inside, and his wife Claire had looked up from the couch where she was feeding Lily, 14 months old, still surprised by the existence of her own fingers, and she had known from his face before he said a word. That had been the first cascade. North Grid had folded 8 weeks later. Claire had been promoted at her law firm 3 months after that, which meant longer hours, which meant Ethan taking more of the domestic weight, which he had done without resentment, and with, it turned out, genuine skill. He could cook 4 things well and everything else adequately. He read to Lily every night, in voices. He learned, with the methodical patience that characterized everything he did, which playgrounds had the best drainage, and which pediatric offices ran late, and which grocery stores had the shortest lines on Wednesday afternoons. Then Claire had left. Not badly, there was no cruelty in it. No dramatic collapse, just the slow recognition, mutual and honest, that the people they had become in the aftermath of North Grid were not the people who had married each other. She had moved to Portland. She called Lily every Sunday at 7. She was a good mother, within the constraints of a life that had taken her elsewhere. Ethan had stayed. He'd built a freelance practice in systems architecture, the invisible work of making sure large networks didn't fall down. He had clients he'd never met in person. He worked from the apartment, from coffee shops, from the library 2 blocks east when Lily was in school, and he needed silence. He charged less than he should have, and worked more hours than was sustainable, and saved carefully toward the thing that had arrived 6 weeks ago. Lily's pediatric cardiologist, a kind man named Dr. Hartwell in Seattle, who had reviewed her echocardiogram and said the word anomaly in the specific tone that meant he wanted to look again, more carefully, with better equipment. Dr. Hartwell had been thorough in the way that good physicians are thorough, not alarming, not dismissive, occupying the precise, careful center where honesty and compassion meet. He had explained the variation in her cardiac structure. He had drawn a small diagram on the paper that covered the examination table. He had said the phrase, watchful waiting, and the phrase, follow-up imaging, and the phrase, the sooner we know, the more options we have, and Ethan had sat in the molded plastic chair beside the examination table and listened with the complete stillness of a man absorbing information that will require all available resources to process. Lily had been sitting on the examination table in a paper gown, swinging her feet, looking at the diagram Dr. Hartwell had drawn. "Is that my heart?" she had asked. "That's a drawing of your heart," Dr. Hartwell had said. He was the kind of doctor who answered children's questions directly, without adjustment for age, which Ethan respected immediately. "It doesn't look like the ones on Valentine's cards," Lily said. "The ones on Valentine's cards are decorative. This is functional." Dr. Hartwell had pointed to the diagram. "This is what a working heart actually looks like. The pointy part is called the apex. It points down and slightly to the left. Mine points down and slightly to the left? Yours points exactly where it should." She had looked at the diagram for another moment. "Then what's wrong with it?" "We're not sure anything is wrong. There's a variation in one of the walls that we want to look at more carefully. Like finding a scratch on a car, it might be nothing. Or it might be the beginning of something we want to know about. Either way, we want to look." Lily had accepted this with the equanimity of a child who had been raised by someone who answered questions honestly. She had asked one more. "Will looking hurt?" "Not at all," Dr. Hartwell had said. "You won't feel a thing." Ethan had called Seattle Children's that evening and scheduled the imaging appointment for the soonest available date. He had booked the cheapest available round-trip flight. He had called Claire in Portland, who had offered to come, and he had said that wasn't necessary, and they had both understood that what he meant was that he needed to be the one doing this particular thing, and that her presence would complicate the emotional geometry in ways he wasn't equipped to manage, while also managing everything else. He had not told anyone else, not his clients, not his neighbors, not the pediatric nurse who called to confirm the appointment, who asked whether Lily would need anything special, and to whom he had said no, "She'll be fine," and then sat for a moment after hanging up with the phone in his hand, testing the truth of it. The flight to Seattle was not a vacation. The upgrade was the algorithm's indifferent generosity, and Ethan had taken it because the boarding pass said so, and there was no reason not to. He was not embarrassed by his coat or his boots or the duffel bag among the monogrammed luggage. He was tired in the specific way of someone who had been managing fear quietly for 6 weeks and intended to keep doing so until there was new information. He looked out the window past Lily's shoulder. The snow was still falling. The ground crew moved in orange vests through the white. Beside him, Lily had opened the small notebook she carried everywhere, a composition book with a red cover, half filled with drawings of animals and floor plans of imaginary houses, and lists of words she was learning to spell. She was drawing the wing of the airplane with focused, methodical strokes. "That's pretty good," Ethan said. "The wing is hard," she said. "It has a funny shape. Aerodynamics." "What's that?" "The way air moves around things. The wing is shaped so that air going over the top moves faster than air going under the bottom. And that difference creates lift." He paused. "Which is what keeps us up." Lily drew the wing again, slightly differently. Faster on top, she said. Slower on bottom. That's right. So the wing is tricking the air. He looked at her. I suppose it is. She seemed satisfied with this. She went back to drawing. The door at the front of the aircraft closed. The seatbelt sign illuminated. Outside, the snow had thickened to the point where the terminal building was just a shape, then a suggestion, then gone entirely. 32 minutes into the flight, once the turbulence from the initial climb through the storm had settled, and the seatbelt sign had gone dark, and the attendants had begun their first-class service with the quiet efficiency of a well-rehearsed choreography, the man in 2B pressed the call button. His name was Gordon Ashby. He was the kind of man who understood leverage, not as a moral category but as a practical one, the way engineers understand stress and architects understand load-bearing walls. He had flown first class for 14 years. He knew which airports had the fastest security lanes, and which hotels had the best late checkouts, and which airline employees, when approached correctly, could solve problems that were not technically within their authority to solve. He was good at this. He had built a life that was largely frictionless, and the friction he occasionally encountered: the delayed flight, the overbooked conference room, the seat beside a stranger who had not been adequately vetted by the market forces he believed in. He addressed with the methodical precision of a man who has never lost the habit of winning small. He had been watching Ethan Cole since boarding with the patience of someone who was not in a hurry, and he had reached a conclusion that he now intended to act on. Diane appeared at his side within 40 seconds. Mr. Ashby, he leaned slightly toward her. His voice was pitched low. Not for privacy, exactly, but for the effect that low voices have when they carry authority. Several passengers could hear him. He knew this. There seems to be a situation, he said, with some of the seating assignments in this cabin. Diane's expression remained professional. Is there something I can help you with specifically? I'm a platinum member, Ashby said. I've been on 21 flights with this carrier in the last calendar year. He let the number settle. The upgrade policy is supposed to prioritize consistent travelers. I'm wondering if there's been an error. I can look into your upgrade status. It's not about my status. He glanced, briefly but clearly, toward row 3. I'm raising a question about the process. Diane's eyes moved. Returned. She kept her smile in place with the discipline of long practice. I understand. I'll make a note and speak with the lead attendant. She moved away. Ashby returned to his phone. In row 3, Ethan had heard all of it. He was looking at the seat back in front of him with the careful neutrality of a man who has practiced not reacting. His hands were in his lap. Beside him, Lily was drawing and had not looked up. The cabin had the particular quality of a room in which everyone is pretending not to have heard something. 10 minutes later, a different attendant appeared at row 3. His name tag read Patrick. He was the senior cabin crew, and he had the build and bearing of a former hospitality school graduate who had long ago learned that his job was to manage situations before they became incidents. Mr. Cole. His voice was warm, practiced, sincere in the way that warmth without content is sincere. I apologize for disturbing you. I wanted to follow up on your boarding assignment. Ethan looked up. It's correct. I have the confirmation number if you need it. Of course, of course. No question about that. Patrick smiled carefully. I wanted to offer, and this is entirely optional. There is absolutely no obligation. We do have a seat available in premium economy that's extremely comfortable. Row 8, an aisle seat, quite spacious. Normally, it's an upgrade from. We're in an upgrade, Ethan said. We were given these seats at the gate. Absolutely, and those seats are yours. Patrick paused. I only mention the alternative as a comfort option. Some passengers find we're comfortable here. Another pause. Patrick was skilled enough to read the room, or at least skilled enough to read this particular moment of it. He nodded once, slowly. Of course. Thank you for your patience, Mr. Cole. Please let me know if there's anything I can get for you or your daughter. He moved on. The cabin resettled. The ambient noise of the aircraft engine hum, recycled air. The occasional ping of the seatbelt reminder filled the space where the conversation had been. Lily looked up from her notebook. "Daddy," she said, in her careful, quiet voice, "did we do something wrong?" The cabin went completely silent. Not dramatically, there were no gasps, no turning heads. But the quality of attention in first class changed in the way that water changes quality when something falls into it from above. The silence spread outward from row 3 inches, a slow, invisible ring. Ethan looked at his daughter. She had set down her pencil. She was looking at him with the direct, trustful gaze of a 6-year-old who understands that something is happening but not yet what it means. The gaze that asks, "Tell me it's okay," without using those words, because she already knows that if it were obviously okay, he would have said so. "No," he said. His voice was steady. "We didn't do anything wrong." "Then why did the man come to talk to us?" "He was just checking on us." Ethan put his hand over hers on the armrest. "We're fine. We have our seats. We're going to see Dr. Hartwell tomorrow, and then we're going to eat the salmon that Seattle is famous for." "You said, Seattle is famous for coffee." "It's famous for both." She picked up her pencil. She went back to the wing, but the trust in her face, when she looked back down at the page, had something new in it, something that was the beginning of a question she didn't yet know how to ask but would not forget. The woman in 2A had not looked up through any of this. She was not pretending to work, she actually was working. The stack of documents beside her was real. The annotations she was making in the margins were substantive. Her name was Victoria Hale, and she was the chief executive of Hale Logistics Group, which had revenue of $4.2 billion in the previous fiscal year and operated freight infrastructure across 11 states and 3 international ports. She was 53 years old, had gray threaded through dark hair that she wore pulled back, and had the quality of stillness that belongs to people who have learned to conserve energy across long days. She had heard the entire exchange. She had heard Gordon Ashby's low, leveraged murmur to Diane. She had heard Patrick's careful navigation of the impossible middle position, and she had heard the child in 3B ask her father whether they had done something wrong. Victoria Hale had 2 daughters of her own. They were in college and graduate school respectively, and she had not been on a school trip since the younger one was in 2nd grade, but she remembered certain things about 7-year-olds with the specificity of muscle memory. She also remembered, with different specificity, the name she had just heard. She took off her reading glasses. She set them on the tray table. She turned in her seat slowly, without drama, and looked at row 3. The man in 3A was looking at his daughter. He had the angular face of someone who had lost weight gradually, over years, from the specific attrition of doing everything himself. His coat was damp at the collar. His hands, both visible now, one still covering his daughter's on the armrest, were the hands of someone who worked with keyboards and occasionally with tools. Victoria said his name. "Ethan Cole," not loudly. "Precisely. The way you say something when you are certain of it." The man looked up. The cabin stopped. Patrick had been 3 steps toward the galley. He turned. Gordon Ashby in 2B lowered his phone. The woman in 4A, who had been feigning sleep with the practiced art of a frequent flyer, opened her eyes. Victoria Hale was looking at Ethan Cole with an expression that was not dramatic, not triumphant, not vindicated. It was the expression of recognition, the expression of someone placing a fact that has been in the back of a filing cabinet for 7 years and has just become relevant. "North Grid Systems," she said. "November, 7 years ago." Ethan Cole went very still. This is the thing about moments of recognition. They do not arrive complete. They arrive as a first word, and then the rest of the sentence assembles itself in the space behind it. In this case, the sentence was 7 years old. North Grid Systems had been, at the time of its decline, a mid-tier logistics software company with a contract to manage routing infrastructure for 7 regional freight operators. Victoria Hale's company, not yet public, not yet what it would become, had been one of them. The contract was worth $11 million annually and was the largest single vendor relationship in her company's portfolio. It was, at the time, load-bearing. In the 3rd week of November, 7 years prior, a systems audit had flagged an anomaly in Northgrid's routing database, a conflict in the redundancy protocols that, if triggered during peak load, would have corrupted the scheduling data for all 7 freight operators simultaneously. The estimated exposure: $14 million in misrouted freight, late fees, and client penalties. For a company of Victoria's size at that time, it would have been a serious injury. The anomaly was discovered on a Wednesday. By Thursday morning, it had been corrected. The audit report, filed 2 days later, attributed the correction to overnight systems work and listed no individual responsible. Victoria had requested a supplemental report. She wanted to know who had done the overnight work. The supplemental report came back with a name: Ethan Cole, Systems Architect, Level 3. No explanation of why he'd been there after hours. No request for recognition or compensation. Just the work. Done. With the documentation correct and the correction thorough. She had done some research, because she always did. The overnight logs showed he had been on site from 10:42 p.m. to 4:17 a.m. He had submitted a brief incident report at 4:33 a.m. from a terminal in the server room. 3 paragraphs. The anomaly, the correction, the verification. It read like something written by a person who had fixed problems quietly for so long that the documentation had become instinct. What she could not determine from the records was why he had been there at all. The fault had been flagged by the audit, with a severity rating of medium, meaning 2-week remediation, not overnight response. Nobody had asked him to fix it that night. Nobody had known he was there. He had presumably seen the flag, understood the exposure, done the arithmetic on the potential consequences, and decided that 2 weeks was longer than the problem warranted. She had written his name in the margin of the report and put it in a folder. Northgrid had folded 8 weeks later. She had received the standard vendor termination notice and moved her contract to a different provider. She had not thought about Ethan Cole for 7 years. Until 30 seconds ago, she looked at him now across the gap between rows 2 and 3, and she saw the coat and the boots and the duffel bag and the small girl with the mismatched mittens and the notebook, and she saw the way he had sat through the past 40 minutes absolutely still, absolutely composed, absorbing the pressure of a cabin that had decided, on no evidence, that he did not belong. There was something instructive in how he had done it. Not absent, not dissociated, fully present, fully aware, and simply choosing to give the situation only what it deserved, which was nothing. She had employed people who talked about equanimity as a practice. In Ethan Cole, in this cabin, it looked like something harder and simpler. The discipline of a person who has learned to save his energy for things that actually matter. "You fixed the November redundancy fault," she said. "Overnight. You didn't file for overtime." Ethan looked at her for a long moment. "It needed fixing," he said. That was all. That was the whole explanation. Patrick had stopped moving entirely. Gordon Ashby in 2B was watching the conversation with the careful attention of a man recalculating something. The rest of first class had the quality of an audience that is trying to be invisible. Victoria turned back to face forward for a moment. Then she pressed the call button. Diane appeared. "Miss Hale." Victoria looked at her without expression. "When we land, I'll be filing a service review. I'd like the incident number for the seating inquiry that was raised earlier in this flight." Diane's face changed in the way that faces change when the coordinates of a situation reveal themselves to be different from what was assumed. "Of course. I also want to be clear," Victoria continued, in the same measured tone, "that Mr. Cole's boarding pass is valid. That he has been in possession of a valid boarding pass for this cabin since check-in, and that he was subjected to an unnecessary inquiry in front of his daughter." She paused. "I want that documented," Diane said. "I understand. I'm not asking you to apologize to me. I'm asking you to recognize that something happened here that should not have." A pause. "That's different." Diane turned to row 3. Her face had the quality of a person setting down a version of themselves they had been carrying for too long. "Mr. Cole, on behalf of the crew, I'm sorry for any discomfort this evening." Ethan looked at her steadily. "Thank you," he said. Nothing more. Not gracious in the way that performs forgiveness. Just, thank you. The acknowledgement of a gesture made. He thought about what it cost her. That apology not much, in the grand scheme, but more than nothing. She had been following a script written by someone else, and now she was stepping outside it. At the request of a woman who had the specific authority that comes from moving freight across 11 states. It was not courage exactly. But it was something. He thought about Patrick, too, who had appeared at his row, and performed his carefully engineered diplomacy with the practiced skill of a man who had de-escalated many situations and who had, probably, never considered that he was in the escalation business until this moment. Patrick was still somewhere in the back of the cabin, behind the curtain. Ethan did not feel anger toward him. He felt the tiredness of recognizing a familiar pattern. The careful middleman, the politely maintained structure of a world that has decided, before you've said a word, where you belong. Gordon Ashby in 2B had returned his eyes to his phone. But the phone's screen was dark. He was staring at the reflection of the cabin in it. The woman in 4A had closed her eyes again. This time it seemed genuine. Lily had watched the whole thing from the window seat, without fully comprehending it, and with the complete focus of a child who understands that something important has happened and is storing it for later consideration. She had a gift, Ethan had noticed when she was about 4. For patience with things she didn't yet understand, for holding questions open, rather than forcing them to premature answers. She would come back to this evening, he knew. In a week or a month or a year, she would ask a question he would not have anticipated, and he would have to be ready with an honest answer. "Who is that lady?" she whispered to Ethan. "Someone I used to work near," he said. "She knows your name." "That's good," Lily said with the confidence of 6-year-old logic, and went back to her drawing. Outside, beyond the dark oval window, there was nothing visible, only the cloud layer below them, faintly luminous, a ceiling made of weather. Somewhere beneath it, Chicago was still in the storm, still managing its million ordinary difficulties. Ethan was 4 hours above it, in a seat he had not asked for, in a situation he had not engineered, moving toward a morning that would tell him something definitive about his daughter's heart. The aircraft moved through the dark above the cloud layer. Below, somewhere, Chicago was disappearing into the storm. Ahead, Seattle was 4 hours west and 8 hours into a different morning. Ethan sat with his daughter's hand under his, and looked at the seat back, and did not think very much about anything, which was the closest he had come to peace in 6 weeks. Victoria waited until the cabin lights had dimmed, and Lily had fallen asleep. Which happened, with the sudden totality that belongs only to exhausted children, her head against the window, the red notebook open in her lap to the half-finished wing before she turned in her seat again. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. For the way this evening went, Ethan looked at her. "You don't need to apologize for things you didn't do. I didn't stop them when I could have stopped them sooner." He considered this. "It's a short flight," he said. "It's fine." Victoria looked at him for a moment. "You don't sound fine." "I'm fine about this. I'm not fine about other things." He said it plainly, without self-pity and without invitation. Simply, "There are things in my life that require strength, and this was not one of them." "Seattle," she said. "Business? Medical?" He glanced at Lily. "Her cardiologist is at Seattle Children's. Follow-up imaging." A pause. Victoria's face was still not cold, but careful, in the way of a person who knows how to hold space without filling it. "How long has she been dealing with it?" "They found the anomaly 8 months ago. Routine screening. It might be nothing, a structural variation that causes no functional problem. Or it might be something that needs intervention. We don't know yet. That's what tomorrow is about." "Has she been symptomatic?" "Not visibly." He looked at his daughter's sleeping face. "She runs. She laughs. She draws wing cross-sections in composition notebooks. A brief quiet. She asks excellent questions. I noticed. The hardest part," he said, and then stopped. Began again. "The hardest part is that she knows something is happening but not exactly what. She has inherited my habit of observing without reacting, which means She's absorbing things she's not yet showing. Victoria was quiet for a moment. You've been doing this alone. It was not a question, so he did not answer it as one. Her mother is in Portland. We're in communication. Lily sees her every other month. He paused. But yes, another silence. This one had more room in it. What are you doing for work? Victoria asked. Freelance systems architecture. Infrastructure consulting. I have 7 active clients, mostly logistics adjacent, some supply chain, one manufacturing company in Ohio that I've been with for 3 years. He said it without defensiveness and without the performed casualness of someone managing how they're perceived. Just, this is the shape of my life. Do you know what Hale Logistics does? Since you mentioned Northgrid, I've been running through your profile in my head. He almost smiled. You've expanded significantly. 5 acquisitions in 6 years. The Pacific Northwest Corridor build-out in 2021 was the routing architecture on that was interesting. Whoever designed it understood long-haul load distribution. Victoria looked at him carefully. I had 3 outside consultants on that. 2 of them I've worked with since. The redundancy protocols have a gap in the Northwest to inland transfer logic. Ethan said. Not critical. But it's there. If you ever run at more than 90% capacity on the Cascades corridor simultaneously with a Western port delay, the buffer logic will start making conservative assumptions that don't account for the real-time rerouting data. You'd see delays cascade in a way that looks random but isn't. A pause that lasted several seconds. You identified that from public infrastructure reporting, Victoria said slowly, and the quarterly throughput data you publish for your freight partners. He paused. I'm sorry. I'm not sure why I said that, because you can't help it, she said. And there was something in her voice that was almost warm. Not the warmth of graciousness, but something more earned than that. The recognition of a characteristic she had seen before in the late-night incident report filed from an empty server room. You saw a problem. You noted it. You can't not note it. That's the same thing that put you in a server room at 2 in the morning 7 years ago. Ethan said nothing. He was looking at the seat back in front of him with the focused inward expression of someone who has been seen accurately and is deciding how to respond to that. I've been trying to hire someone like you for 18 months, Victoria said. More than 18 months, honestly. I've interviewed 14 candidates for the position I have in mind. 4 of them had better credentials on paper than you do. All 4 of them had very specific plans for what they would do in the role. Very impressive plans. Very polished. Very focused on what the role would do for them. She paused. You just told me about a gap in my infrastructure. Unprompted. In the middle of a conversation about something else entirely. And then apologized for it. That's what I'm looking for. Ethan looked at her. What's the position? Head of infrastructure, Victoria said. Full-time. Benefits, good ones. Including dependent medical that would cover Lily's care comprehensively, with no network restrictions for specialists. The work is primarily remote with quarterly travel. Seattle office, which is relevant given her treatment, is there, but the role is based wherever you are. Chicago is fine. She paused. The salary is competitive. I'd rather discuss it in a proper conversation than an airplane. But I can tell you it's significantly more than 7 active freelance clients. Ethan looked at her for a long moment. You're making a significant offer to someone you haven't spoken to in 7 years. Someone you've spoken to for approximately 15 minutes. I know what I saw 7 years ago. And I've spent the last hour watching you conduct yourself in a situation designed to make you feel small. You didn't. She folded her hands on the tray table. Character doesn't change. Skills can be updated. Character is either there, or it isn't. You have a board, he said, an HR process. You can't just, I can recommend. Strongly. The final offer goes through the proper channels. A pause. But I'm the CEO. When I recommend someone strongly, the channels tend to reach the same conclusion I have. She looked at him levelly. I'm not offering you charity. I'm offering you a role I need filled by someone I trust. Those are different things. Ethan sat for a moment. Outside, the dark pressed against the window. Somewhere ahead, invisible, the cascades were rising. I need someone who understands systems at a level that most people in my industry don't, Victoria continued. And who has the character not to cut corners when cutting corners would be invisible. You've already demonstrated both. 7 years ago, and in the last 10 minutes, she reached into the inside pocket of her charcoal coat and produced a card cream-colored, the Hale Logistics Group name, in understated serif type. She held it out. He took it. Think about it, she said. Whatever you decide, I hope tomorrow goes well. She looked at Lily's sleeping face, the red notebook, the half-drawn wing. She asked the right question, about the wing tricking the air. She usually asks the right question. That's a gift, Victoria said. Don't let anyone convince her otherwise. She turned back to her work. She put her reading glasses on. She picked up her pen. Ethan sat for a long time looking at the card in his hand. It was a small rectangle of cream paper. It weighed nothing. He turned it once, twice, between his fingers. And then he put it carefully in the breast pocket of his damp coat, against his chest, where he would feel it for the rest of the flight. There is a specific light that comes through airplane windows over the Pacific Northwest, just before descent, not quite dawn, not quite the gray of a full overcast sky, but something in between, a light that has traveled a great distance and arrived humbled by it, softer than coastal light, more honest. Lily woke 20 minutes before landing with the immediate alertness of someone who has been storing energy. Are we there? Almost. Look, you can see mountains. She pressed her face to the window. Through the clouds, the cascades were intermittently visible white above the tree line, dark below it, immovable in the way of things that have been standing longer than anyone alive. They're very big, she said. They are. Bigger than the buildings at home? Much bigger. The buildings at home are made by people. Those were made by, he paused, the way he always paused when he wanted to get this right. By time and pressure and heat, different kinds of building. Lily considered this for a long moment. What happens next? She asked. It was what she always asked. At transitions, not anxiously, but with genuine curiosity, the way a scientist asks what happens next when one experiment concludes and another is about to begin. It was her way of checking that the map was still legible. Ethan looked at his daughter, at the mountains behind her, at the pale morning light coming through the oval window. He had the business card in the breast pocket of his coat. He had put it there during the night, and he had been aware of it the way you are aware of something that has changed the weight distribution of what you're carrying. We land, he said. We go to the hotel and sleep a few hours. Then we go see Dr. Hartwell. And then we have the salmon that Seattle is famous for. And the coffee, she added, because she had a 6-year-old's precise memory for corrections. And the coffee. She turned back to the mountains. And then home? Yes, he said. And then home. She settled back in her seat. She opened the red notebook and looked at the wing she had drawn, unfinished, from the night before. She picked up her pencil. She added, with careful, deliberate strokes, the way the wing curved into the fuselage, the part she had been unable to get right before, which she could now see, from this angle, clearly. There, she said quietly. To herself, or to him, or to the drawing. It wasn't entirely clear. The announcement came. The cabin prepared for landing. Tray tables, seat backs. The curtain between first class and the rows behind pulled aside. Gordon Ashby, in 2B, was already in his coat. His bag retrieved, the cufflinks catching the morning light with the indifferent brightness of things that belong to people who have not recently considered whether they deserve to be there. Victoria Hale was on her phone, a call she had placed or received, something brief and precise about a meeting being rescheduled. She glanced once toward row 3. Ethan caught her eye. He nodded once, slightly. She returned to her call. The wheels touched the runway at Seattle-Tacoma, with a sound like a single, definitive period at the end of a very long sentence. The cabin stirred back into motion. Overhead bins opened. The particular noise of an aircraft at the end of a flight buckles, bags, the soft percussion of people reassembling their lives after several hours of suspension filled the space that silence had occupied. Gordon Ashby in 2B was on his feet before the seatbelt sign had fully extinguished. He moved toward the front of the cabin, with the efficient purpose of a man who had done this on hundreds of flights and intended to keep doing it indefinitely. He did not look at row 3. Ethan did not watch him go. Victoria Hale remained seated until the aisle cleared. The way experienced travelers do, she closed her laptop. She gathered her papers with the unhurried precision of someone who knew there was no advantage in rushing. When she stood, she glanced once toward row 3, not meaningfully, not dramatically. Just the natural survey of a person checking her surroundings. Ethan caught her eye. He nodded once, slightly. She returned to her coat, to her bag, to the gate ahead. Outside the terminal windows, snow was falling, not heavily, not like Chicago, but the light and tentative snow of a city that is not used to it, that receives it with something between inconvenience and wonder. The mountains were gone behind clouds. The terminal was warm and bright. Ethan helped Lily into her purple coat with the broken zipper, noting, again, that it needed replacing. And thinking that it would be replaced soon, and meaning it this time with a solidity he had not allowed himself before. The solidity of a man who has looked at a card in his breast pocket for 4 hours, and understood, somewhere in the middle of the dark above Oregon, that he is going to make the call. Not tonight. Tonight was for a hotel room with a small bed for Lily, and a too-soft mattress for him. And 8 hours of sleep before the morning that would tell him what he needed to know about his daughter's heart. But the call would be made. The decision had formed itself somewhere between the cloud layer and the Cascades. In the quiet way that decisions form when you stop trying to make them and simply let the available information settle. She took his hand. They walked out of the jet bridge and into the light of the terminal. In his breast pocket, a business card. In his chest, the particular lightness of something that has been held tightly for a long time and is beginning, carefully, to be set down. Lily was looking at the departures board the way she looked at everything, with complete attention, cataloging, asking the next question. So many places, she said. So many. Have you been to all of them? Some. Not all. Which ones haven't you been to? He looked at the board. The names of cities: Louisville, Portland, Boston, Atlanta, Denver, Dallas, Calgary, lit and unlit, arriving and departing, the ordinary geography of a continent going about its morning. All the ones I haven't been to yet, he said. Lily thought about this with the seriousness it deserved. That's actually most of them, she said. It is, he agreed, and they walked on, into the noise and warmth of the terminal, toward the morning that was waiting for them, not promised, not guaranteed, but possible, which has always been the most that any morning offers. And which has always been enough.